Okay, let's start. It is well, it's a real pleasure to introduce my colleague. We are one SAIS campus, Matthias, and well, Matthias is well, you probably know, is the dean Acheson chair at SAIS and is associate professor of international political economy in DC. But he is the quintessential SAIS alumnus and student. So I think. He started here doing the master program in Bologna. He moved to DC to finish his PhD. He came back to teach here, and he continued going back and forth from the two campuses. So this is the kind of great colleague we have, and the kind of colleague we want to have here in Bologna. And his talk today is about single market power, how Europe surpassed America, and you just let us know following which kind of traffic laws. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
Okay, so, Matthias, you have like 35, 40 minutes. If you have some impelling clarification question, just raise your hand. Otherwise, Matthias will answer all your doubts and questions in the QA session. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so that's, if you do, I'll repeat the question so people who are joining virtually right now or want to watch this later, I imagine thousands and thousands or so, can understand. So thank you, Tito. Thank you, Professor Cordella, for that very kind introduction. So I wanted to use this talk to talk about something I've been working on with Craig Parsons at the University of Oregon for a few years now, and it comes from my own work on kind of looking at the crises of European integration in the last 15 years, where I always felt that Europe was overdoing something, right? They were either overdoing fiscal austerity, or they were overdoing structural reform, or they were so rules focused that when I started talking to Craig about this, and then he started pointing out to me, I was like, well, actually, the United States, there's quite a bit more flexibility when it comes to states, what they can do on the economic front. And so this is a paper about single market and single market rules, and the kind of legislative kind of framework which Brussels has created, the EU single market. But you could make a probably similar argument on the fiscal authority front, right? So if you think about, I'll give you one example that's, I think, close to home here in Italy. If you think about the infamous 2018 budget that the at the time populist government put together, so the Cinque Stelle, the Five-Star Movement, and Lega that were in a coalition together, that was rejected by the European Commission, and they had to go back to the drawing board, and they had to kind of alter it and so on. And I remember thinking at the time, and I said this to Craig, I was like, I mean, can you imagine a Texan Republican governor putting together a budget that his Republican majorities in the Senate House, in the Texas Senate and the Senate House have approved, that before he can even put it to a vote, he has to send it to some DC bureaucrat who can then say, actually, I don't like it. Start again. I was like, Texas would secede, right? I mean, I'm exaggerating it a bit, but I think the point is that there's often quite a bit of authority or sovereignty or policy discretion that EU member states have delegated or given up, if you want, to European institutions that would be quite controversial in a US state context, right? And the United States is a federal state, right? With all the things that come with that, right? Military and a political history and they fought wars together and so on. And so in that sense, I never want to push this comparison too much, right? Because then very quickly EU federalists want to think, oh yeah, we're just on this way towards a federal state of Europe or something. And I think that's a very different discussion that I want to have. So let's focus on the single market today and start with those two gentlemen, right? And so and they're both actually former prime ministers of Italy, come to think about it. On the left is Enrico Letta, who was briefly prime minister, I guess, between 2013 and 2014. And then, of course, Mario Draghi, best known, I think, as former President of the European Central Bank, but of course also briefly Prime Minister of Italy. So what these two have in common right now is that they've both been tasked by Europe to look at the left. He is from the left. Enrico Letta is looking at the single market and how we can improve the single market to become, more prosperous and all these things. And of course, Mario Draghi on the right was also tasked, slightly different brief, to focus on competitiveness, right? So I think that's probably more outward looking on how the EU can compete with China, with the United States, with the rest of the world. But both are very heavily, again, looking at Europe's single market, how to improve it. And so that's been a very systematic thing, right? Is that this idea of Europe's single market is incomplete. It's an incomplete imitation of American. So I quote a colleague of ours, we were briefly colleagues at American University, Michelle Egan, who wrote a very good book, an Oxford book in 2015 on single markets. And the opening quote she uses is Viviane Reding, who was a commissioner at the time, saying we could learn a lot from America about how to utilize and develop a single market. Right? And it's not just scholars. Economists here, Bruegel report. Bruegel is the kind of premier economics EU think tank in Brussels. And this is Osilu and co-authors in 2017. It is estimated that remaining non-tariff obstacles, in particular in services sectors, limit intra-EU trade to a level about 4 times smaller than the intensity of trade between US states. By completing the single market, the EU could generate significant income gains. And then finally, that great newspaper, as it calls itself, The Economist, in September 2019, so in the midst of the kind of Brexit drama that's unfolding in the UK, in theory, the EU's 500 million citizens, this still includes UK citizens, live in a single economic zone, much like America, with nothing to impede the free movement of goods, services, people, and capital. But in reality, Europe's single market is creaking and incomplete, right? And so whenever anything else fails and growth slows down in Europe, you see many people, and of course, we need to complete the single market, right? I mean, there's still so much to be gained from completing this. And so, and again, this is a comparison. I want to focus on the US-EU comparison today, but you can actually apply this to places like Australia and Canada, right? So if you take Canada, Australia, United States, these are not the types of socialist countries that would immediately come to mind, right? When you think about single markets, right? These are very kind of pro-free market countries from a kind of OECD point of view, relatively small states, right? Compared to Europe. And so if you think about all three, they're federal states, right? So there's provinces in Canada, states in US and Australia, also subunits, right? And so if you think about the legal standard for interstate openness, right? So in the US, the Constitution is interpreted, the Commerce Clause of the US Constitution is interpreted to bar only purposeful discrimination, right? Plenty of discrimination to go around, but that's not purposeful, that's fine. And so exceptions are allowed if they're balanced by other purposes. So often this is public health issues, things like that, environmental concerns, things of that nature. Australia, Constitution interpreted to bar only discriminatory burdens of a protectionist kind, and exceptions again allowed if appropriate and adapted to their purpose. Canada, similar. Constitution interpreted to bar state laws only if the primary purpose is if they're openly protectionism, right? So it doesn't need exceptions, allows states to do almost anything. Right? There's been these famous cases I mean, alcohol is a very good example in Canada that's sold by the provinces, right? And that you can't just get across border, right? Get provincial borders. So the EU, here the treaty is interpreted to bar rules capable of hindering, directly or indirectly, actually or potentially, intra-community trade, or that makes less attractive cross-border services. And so this is a much stronger commitment here, from starting with the Treaty of Rome. And it also must be necessary for clear public policy objectives. It must be non-discriminatory and suitable and minimal to obtain the objective. That's the exception here, right? So if you look at the political form of recent steps that were taken to reduce internal barriers, because in the end, and I'm happy in the Q&A to give you 15 examples of how hard it is to do services trade in the United States because of licensing, how many exceptions there are, even to some goods. The qualifications of lifts is one of my favorites, of elevators, things like that, right? So what's striking, the United States, Canada, Australia, there's quite a bit of discrimination going on, especially on services, to some extent on goods, but also things like public procurement, which I'll talk about in a minute. And there's actually, for all the free marketeers alive in the US, in Canada and Australia, there's been very little action taken. In the US, none. In Australia was a voluntary deal between the provinces and federations since the 1990s. And also in Canada, more recently, there's again been this voluntary deal. In the EU, no such thing, right? This is their legal requirements. It's explicit in EU legislation, and there's very active enforcement. Maybe not so much under the von der Leyen Commission, right? And we can talk about this. At the end, I'll talk about that some of this stuff is somewhat under threat in the last 5 years. Also, the world's changing, right? But in general, during the midst of the Euro crisis, during the midst of the refugee crisis, right, the EU keeps kind of going after these barriers, right? I mean, my favorite example is how many, I want to be nice, right? How many let's call them bureaucrats. How many people are actively working in Brussels today as their day jobs, full-time, looking for barriers to intra-EU trade and finding these, and then, of course, working on getting them removed? Something like 1,600 people, right? How many are working in Washington, D.C., looking at the US markets? 0, none, right? It's just not there, right? And so in the EU, this is actually pretty strict. And then it's the examples I want to focus on: goods, professional qualifications, temporary services, establishment, and public procurement. And again, let's focus on the US EU comparison. So when it comes to good standards, the US has federal regulation, sets floors in some sectors, but far from all, and states set many additional standards, right? I mean, for those of you who are interested in this, you must have heard of the California effect, where California sets higher standards and then some companies actually raise the bar of whatever the minimum is in the US. There's also the Delaware effect, as our friend Elon Musk has learned about, and that's the very low standards that are there to set. I mean, especially when that's why every financial company is there and credit card companies are there, because again, it's very lax. And even in his case, his compensation is being revisited by a Delaware court. In Australia, it's been mostly nationalized since the 1990s. The states adopted some model laws. In Canada, federal regulation sets floors in some sectors, but far from all. States set many additional standards. The EU, again, goes way beyond these states when it comes to its member states. Right? It's an elaborate harmonization or mutual recognition with almost no remaining exception. And that's just for goods. And I'll admit immediately, goods is my weakest case right here to make this point that the EU has gone quite a bit further than the US. Professional qualifications. I think this is something every American will know, right? And it's not just the bar exam, which is different by state, right? Of course, in Europe, that would be equivalent. I mean, whatever Greek law, and a German lawyer couldn't just take this and go practice in Greece, right? I mean, you would have to know something about Greek legislation. But so here, professional qualifications, people usually need different state licenses with different fees and training. And again, it's not lawyers just, right? It's plumbers, it's shrinks, psychologists, it's any sort of contractor where you need local licenses. Medical, of course, same thing, right? And so it's quite significant. My favorite example here is the Pennsylvania hairdresser who moves to Ohio, or the other way around, I could be wrong, needs 1,800 hours worth of training to be able to practice there, right? 1,800, that's a year, right? And a German barber in Berlin can pack up shop tomorrow and open up shop in Bologna, and nobody will ask them, right? Because again, there's a mutual recognition of this sort of thing, right? So in the EU, there's elaborate harmonization or mutual recognition of degrees, licenses, and so on, right? So and then let's look at temporary services. In the US, there's no such concept, but you must be licensed in a state to operate there at all. Right? And this was actually deeply problematic during the pandemic, right? Which we all fondly remember. And so I'll give you a traditional American example. My neighbor was a shrink, right? And he came from Pennsylvania and he had moved to DC and he had kept his license in Pennsylvania and he had a license in DC. Sometimes he went back to see clients in person. In Pennsylvania, no problem. And sometimes he had Zoom calls with clients in Pennsylvania and DC, but he had a license there too, so no problem. But you know, a lot of rich clients with second houses during the pandemic moved to Arizona or California or wherever, Florida. He couldn't see them on Zoom because he needed a license in Florida or Arizona or wherever his clients were staying, right? Some states loosened these restrictions for the pandemic. Some have already reversed them again. Others have kind of let them lapse. But the point is, it's a whole complicated thing. In the EU, the principle is open right to temporary provision of services, required the single point of contact website to streamline access, right? I mean, that's, if you may recall, the famous Polish plumber during the run-up to the EU enlargement in May 1, 2004. I guess today the equivalent is the Ukrainian truck driver, right? And so there's always this idea of, again, like they can just go to if they're members of the single market, they can just provide their services temporarily. Establishment in the US, open in principle, but licensing differences often necessitate multiple firms with distinct structures and tax filings. If you compare it with the US, the principle is establishment in one state meets requirements elsewhere. Again, single point of contact website to streamline access. But the last one, I think public procurement is the most striking to me because that's about taxpayers' money, right? So in the US, states, so again, New York, Michigan, California, right? They can be explicitly protectionist. 47 states have actual in their state constitutions, in state preferences, right? 10% advantages, 15% advantages. In Idaho, they have to actually work, they have to actually live there when they're doing the contract. In Pennsylvania, you have to use Pennsylvania coal if you use coal. It can't come from the world. There's all these things, right? In public procurement. In the US, it's seen as integral to the single market, right? So again, if the Italians want to build a bridge, let's say from Sicily to the mainland, right? And they want to have a public tender, you can't discriminate against a Romanian or a Danish contractor, right? If they have the better bid and it's cheaper, you can't give the Italian company a 10% advantage, which is perfectly normal in the US. So anyway, you see where I'm going, right? This is not an argument about in Europe, there's so much more trade between EU member states. That's not true. Or there's so much more movement of people. Obviously not true. I'll talk about that in a minute. But if you look at how far the EU has actually pushed the legal limits or the legal integration of a single market, it's way beyond individual states. And these are liberal market economies like Canada, Australia, or the US. Nobody will argue about this, right? And so that in the end is the puzzle, right? That I wanna try to explain today and give you kind of our theory for. So the EU today claims and actively exercises more authority to require market openness than any national federal government. And so the question is, why is there so much EU economic authority? And at the same time, that's kind of the irony, right? Why is there still this obsession with going even further, right? Where you could easily make the case that going further now will come at, as I will argue today, it'll come with little economic benefit and probably much bigger political costs, right? Because in the end, democracy is still very much at the nation state level. So what I thought I'd do briefly is let's take EU integration theories, intergovernmentalism, neo-functionalism, constructivism, these sorts of things, right? Briefly, and apply them to the US, right? And what these theories should tell us about what the US should look like. So if we take that much criticized theory of Andy Moravcsik in 1998 when he wrote The Choice for Europe, Liberal Intergovernmentalism, this was the theory in a nutshell. cross-border exchange incentivizes interest groups to prefer interstate opening. They will then ask and support their governments to negotiate these sort of credible commitments to the central rules. And Moravcik's argument is that actually in an international relations context, states can actually do so with minimal concessions to sovereignty. So just from this point of view alone, right, and I'll strengthen that case by saying the fact that in the US, the flows of trade, services, goods, and so on between states is 4 to 5 times bigger in volume than in the EU between, let's say, France and Germany, or between Spain and Italy, or between Poland and Ireland or something, should actually mean that there's even more lobbying in the US, because there's much more money to be made from getting rid of all these. And, you know, you could say even small businesses stand to gain from this. And all Democrats and Republicans love small businesses, right? The backbone of the American economy. So the US actually, from that theory's point of view, should have much stronger internal market rules. If you take neo-functionalism, right, the theory that said that, you know, like cross-border exchange incentivizes interest groups to prefer interstate opening, and then they will delegate this to a supranational authority, or in the US case, to the federal government, right, the equivalent, and that the supranational agents then gain resources, organizational positions to encourage these further delegation. And so this should lead to US federal government employees to want more power here, right? To want to do more of this. They say like, hey, you know, like we can grow even faster, right? And so the legal version is legal mandates invite expansive interpretations, elicit interest group allies, and so on. So again, even from a neo-functionalist argument, the US should have much stronger internal market rules. If you take cultural ideational accounts, the EU is a neoliberal market building project, right? Kate McNamara's early work in the late 90s, Nicola Japko, our colleague at Hopkins, Baltimore, 2006, the kind of strategic constructivism, Craig's own work, the EU as a political project to build central authority. So if the EU goes so far for these reasons, shouldn't the US internal market authority go even further, right? I mean, this is a much more pro-market system, the US. This is a much more pro-market people, right? They're more pro-market ideational context, and also there's a much stronger political identity of the United States in a way that the EU could only dream of, right? There was a war-fighting state, all that stuff that kind of people rallied around the flag. And so what's interesting is that all these expectations from an EU integration literature of what should have happened in the US seem very wrong. With respect to internal market restrictions on state regulatory autonomy, there's no question that EU legal principles are much stronger than the US. There's also no question that the EU has radically more systematic and ambitious legislation to enact such principle, is much more active administratively to implement them, right? The 1600 versus the 0, right? People that are constantly working on this. And again, someone like Dan Kellerman, our friend and colleague, his main critique is like, yeah, sure, but EU enforcement is far from perfectly effective, right? But it's also not plausible to say that it's generally ignored. Maybe the last few years has been more the case, right? Because Europe has had bigger fish to fry. But the key point is the EU tries to administer internal openness at a level the US never even considers. And now I'm sensing it. You're all thinking it. And that's, I'll get to that point in a minute. You're going to say, like, but the US doesn't need to, right? Because they have all these flows already. The EU doesn't, so they need to. The functional argument, I'll get to that in a minute. But if you look at annual European single market legislation from 53 to 2019, there's been an enormous amount of directives, regulations, and decisions, right? The percent of all EU legislative acts by close to 2020 was still about 50%, right? So most of the capacity of the EU to legislate is still focused on this, the single market, right? The US federal market legislation, so there was a bit of this early on, the Commerce Clause and so on, but as I've shown you, this is not actively enforced and actually interpreted quite widely. And most of the single market stuff that's happened has all been prudential, right? A lot of this because of finance, right? And insurance companies and so on. But so let me summarize, and then I'll get into the explanations of the puzzle, right? So if there's 4 basic options in single market rules, you can think of it as the strongest is uniform central regulation. Then there's centrally required mutual recognition, basically home state control. Then there's central floors, partial host state control. You can do more if you want, but there's a kind of minimum, or there's host state control, right? So you would expect the US to have these and the EU to have these, but it's actually the other way around, right? The main EU rules are actually uniform central regulation or very strong mutual recognition. The main US rules are either these central floors or complete host state control. Right? Whatever business gets done in Arizona, Arizona sets the rules, right? And the rest of the states have to kind of adjust to this. So what's a better explanation? And this is, I think, the one that everybody will immediately think about. Well, again, the seductive notion of need, right? You're like, yeah, the US doesn't need these strong internal market rules, right? So yeah, okay, grant you the point. There's quite a bit of stronger legislation and enforcement on the EU side, right? It's not like Paul Ryan, that last great free marketeer, ever used his power to have a single market project and get rid of all these barriers so the US could even be richer, right? Despite the weaker internal openness rules, the US has much higher flows, right? As I mentioned earlier, trade volume between US states is 4 to 5 times higher than between EU member states. And of course, the movement of people between US states is something like 10 to 15 times higher. It's also extremely low in the EU context, right? Even if you want to think of like the Erasmus exchange program, it's 2% of all university students, right? So it is actually, it's an elite, and yeah, they love Europe and so on, all true, but it's not a voting bloc, if you want to think about it this way. And then obviously, the benefits of the fluid economy. They're supported by cultural homogeneity, by a mobile society, by direct action of a large central government and so on. Actually, one example I forgot to give, which I think for Americans will be the most familiar, and that's in-state tuition, right? So you're at Berkeley, you're from Oregon, you have a roommate from California, and you happen to pay 3 times more at the same university. In the EU, if you come to the University of Bologna and you're from an EU member, you pay the same as any Italian, right? Actually, my favorite example was from the UK when it was still a single market member. The Scots put it at 0 tuition. Every EU member could go study in Edinburgh or Glasgow at the same tuition as the Scots, but the English had to pay more because you can discriminate within a member state, but not between. No, I'm not making this up. So the idea that, you say like, yeah, but of course, California, it's state government finances it. They should give preference to California citizens. I was like, yes, but in Europe, there's no such thing, right? And so that's, of course, well, in the UK context, it was problematic because so many more continental students went to study in the UK, and much fewer UK citizens went to study in the rest of Europe, and that they felt that they were taken advantage of. But the point still stands that the Scottish universities could charge higher tuition to English or Welsh or Northern Irish students, but not to Romanians or Belgians or Hungarians, right? And so that's so back to the explanation. You say like, yeah, but again, the US seems to be doing very well. It's growing fast. There's a lot of trade. There's a lot of people's movement. So there's these kind of little annoying licenses requirements if you move. And yeah, there's 3 hairdressers from Ohio who moved to Pennsylvania, need to do 1,800 whatever hours of it. It seems ridiculous, but yeah, we could probably explain this through good old-fashioned interest group politics, right? These are old guilds, and they've kept this, and again, whatever, right? It's not like the US is doing poorly because of it. And then you can say, oh, Europe does, right? There is no cultural homogeneity, right? There's different languages, different traditions, right? It's culturally incredibly diverse, right? These are lower mobility societies, right? When I'll never forget when my youngest sister got married to a guy who lives from a town 40 miles away, and she was at the hairdresser that morning, and she asked, where did you find this your husband? And she was like, well, in this town. He was like, oh my God, 40 miles away. You had to go far to find a husband. So in general, right, we're much more much less mobile. So how many minutes do I have? 10? Perfect. Perfect. That's exactly what I needed. So internal market rules are the main available tool to pursue a fluid economy. So if you're an EU elite market person sitting in Brussels and you want to create this internal market, and you're going to have to push this a little further than the Americans because you don't have the advantage of all the things the Americans already have. So that said, for most political scientists, okay, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen, right? You still need to explain concretely why powerful actors chose to pursue, support, accept certain delegations of authority, right? Why would there be more business pressure for central openness rules in Europe? As I said, the fact that flows are 4 to 5 times higher in the US should actually be countering that argument because there's so much more money to be made, right? If it's just, you know, a little bit of extra money in Greece because you have some business there and it would be slightly easier. I mean, surely if that business would be 5 times larger, you'd have even more incentive to lobby. Also, why would central institutional actors not try to expand their authority in the US? Because that's an often critique of Brussels, right? They're always looking to expand their powers, right? They always are not looking at Michael Lee. Michael was never one of those. But they're always looking to, you know, have more decision-making power. Well, surely federal bureaucrats in the US, why would they be so different? And then I think that's still the main question to answer. Why would Germany and Italy accept delegations of authority that California or Texas successfully oppose? Right? That is still the puzzle. So the answer I'm going to give you is one based around ideas and political coalitions, and that there's basically a tale of 2 varieties of neo or market liberalism, whatever term you want to use. Right? So there's a large literature that now theorizes that public policy trajectories reflect context-specific framing and legitimation, and that is political coalitions and contingent events that link problems, policy solutions, institutional models in very distinct ways. Right? So this literature has already addressed how the Reagan Revolution linked neoliberalism to states' rights and how the Europe Single Market Project linked neoliberalism and EU central authority, but it's never quite, these literatures don't talk to each other, right? You have American political development, you have EU studies, and they pass like ships in the night, right? I mean, there's no, so what Craig and I are trying to do is actually have those 2 bodies of literature talk to each other. And they provide, I think, theoretically a unified account of the different outcomes. So the core of the US story is, let me speed up a slight bit. So there's this quite modest federal commerce clause action before the 1930s. Then federal authority does expand, but it's the other guys, right? It's the left, it's the New Deal, it's Roosevelt, it's FDR, right? They are pushing central authority in the 1940s, but for progressive purposes, right? For Social Security, for Medicare, for things like that, not for internal openness. Later, Reagan neoliberals could nonetheless have used this authority for liberalization, but they didn't, right? It was available, right? They could have really created a Europe-style single market, right? Because that's something I think most free marketeers in the US find unobjectionable compared to the many things they do find objectionable about the EU, right? But they built their political coalition with social conservative, let's call them what it is, racist states' rights activists, right? That basically said, don't touch, right, the kind of state authority on this. And so neoliberalism actually becomes focused on weakening central authority, right? I mean, Reagan's idea, right? The biggest 10 problematic words in government are like, I'm here from the government, I'm here to help. There's a kind of distrust of anything central government does, but interestingly not of state governments, right? And so this generates these kind of powerful knowledge regimes about decentralized market regulation. So the US case is this case where you have the New Deal, which is a coalition against laissez-faire business. It combines rural states, urban lower classes, and eventually also including blacks in the 1960s, right? So there's a business reaction to this, predictable. There's a traditional conservative reaction, which is predictable. And then William Buckley at the National Review tries to fuse this, right? Co-opting in the 1960s during civil rights. This guy here, remember Strom Thurmond in North Carolina, the Southern racist reaction to all of the New Deal stuff, right? And this ends in tears, right? Because 1964, who knows who this is on the bottom? Barry Goldwater, right? Loses against Lyndon Johnson. And so this fails, right? But then since that attempt, so much of the 60s, 70s, you have this mushrooming of conservative think tanks. They're all around the old SAIS, right? American Enterprise Institute, Heritage, Cato, the Federalist Society, the Hoover Institution at Stanford. And so they advocate, and then of course they find in Reagan their big advocate, but it's still that coalition, a coalition of Southern racist, more often than not, states' rights activists saying, stay away from, and of course they use it for education, abortion, like all these things as well, but also including on when it comes to the federal government telling what to do. And so I'm getting close to the end. Now, the core of the EU story, I think, is probably even better known here in Bologna, right? So the EEC treaty gets very ambitious in 1957 about the four freedoms, language that they borrowed from German Orbo liberals. But remember, the early goal is more political and economic. Few expected to deeply limit national regulation, but then the courts come in, right? In the 70s, the court and the commission push their mandates, but without strong support. But it's really then the neoliberal ideas that gain traction, the ideas from Thatcher. And like Reagan, she opposes strong central institutions, right? Very clearly in the context of the EU especially, but she agrees to the Single European Act deal in the mid-80s. So you have kind of a Europeanist reform, a stronger commission, but a neoliberal substance, right? And you could say Thatcher agrees with misgivings. Delors and Mitterrand on the French side agree, but also with misgivings. So you by default end up with a kind of ordoliberal Europe, free market in substance, but with strong central institutions to impose free market rules, right? And so this then creates a knowledge regime about completing the single market. Every problem in Europe can be solved by pushing this further, right? And you can, in many ways, this explains the appeal of Brexit as well, right? That Europe went way too far in strong central authority, and that all they ever even wanted was this neoliberal free trading Europe. So in the end, you have Mitterrand and Delors on the one side, right? They were interested in stronger institutional authority, but much less so in free market ideas. Thatcher was only interested in free market ideas and a single market. And Kohl was kind of in the middle, right? I mean, in the end, you end up with a kind of Germanic Europe in that sense, but not because the Germans pushed for it. They just happened to be in the middle of the bargaining space, closer on free market ideas to the Brits than the French were to the Brits, and closer to allowing the EU having more central authority than, of course, the British were. So, what are the EU-focused takeaways? EU's internal market authority is extraordinarily strong, far stronger than that of any federal state. It's actually no other polity that has ever aimed for such strong rules to complete a single market. And so the institutional preferences for internal market regimes have major autonomy now from substantive policy preference. And so much EU discourse about the incomplete market is actually misleading, right? I'll grant things like the digital single market where, I mean, I think Netflix or any sort of streaming is still very national based, right? The Amazons are national, right? So these sorts of things in the US are much more federal, right? So there's probably some gain to be had from it. But it seems to me the people that are pushing this are overselling these benefits, right? The fact that you have done so much already legalistically on the single market and that you still only have a fifth of US trade or a 10th or 15th of US mobility, then pushing at these frontiers, and you've already so much further, is probably going to do very little from a kind of economic growth point of view. So this is SAIS after all. What's the policy takeaway? The policy takeaway for Europe is stop pushing on this. The single market project is never likely to deliver US-style flows, right? So as I think Craig and I put it in our foreign affairs piece last year, declare victory and stop, right? Like we've won. There's a single market, right? I mean, now whatever you're going to do to push the single market further is going to come at actually quite significant domestic political cost. And so it's not worth it, that trade-off there. Well, for the US, actually, an American single market project is worth considering because there's huge potential benefits if hairdressers can now move to other places and you know, plumbers and all these kind of small businesses don't need to go through all the drama of getting new licenses in different states and so on. And this is even something where you could see bipartisan agreement, right, between free marketeers in the Republic, I mean, in theory at least. So I'll give you one example where there was agreement, that's something they can build on, is military spouses. right? So they made an exception through federal legislation that any spouse of military personnel, and these move around bases all over the US, and then, one of the partners has a real job they need a license for, and so they've waived it. So you don't need, if you move base, you don't need. So if you can do it for military spouses, why can't you do for everybody else, right? And it seems almost obvious. So anyway, I know Tito's going to tell me I'm out of time now. So if there had been time, you could say the last few years it's kind of been a US challenge to this Washington Consensus 2.0, right? Where actually we're majorly going back on this, and for Europe, this challenge has been one of how to increase sovereignty. And so the last point is I want to stress, there is a kind of growing challenge now to single market principles, right? There's renewed enthusiasm for state aid, especially in the case of Germany and France that have used up 70% of all the state aid that's been given since the pandemic. Europe is moving much away from rules to developing all kinds of tools in a geo-economic framework, right? So it's kind of moving away from free market principles. And there's still, that said, it's not been settled, right? I think the internal fight in the Commission can be summed up by the view of somebody like Margrethe Vestager, the Danish very powerful commissioner, who's still very much this old school 1990s way of thinking of competition and ensuring it, right? And someone like Thierry Breton, who's ready to go full-on French-style industrial policy that the Germans are going to pay for, probably. But so that hasn't been settled. It seems to me von der Leyen is closer to Breton's view these days, right? And if she gets a new mandate, I think Europe will move further away from this. But it's still striking when it comes to single markets as recent as 2018, 2019, that Europe is still very much doubling down on this. Okay, let me end right there and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthias. Great talk. I have myself a lot of questions, but I think it is better to leave the students talk first. So please, let's take 3 or 4 questions.
Can you manage the show and I'll write down and
Okay.
come up with answers?
So let's take like 3 questions at a time.
Hi, again, I'm Alessandra. I'm in the European Public Policy Program, and I wanted to ask a question regarding the EU and the banking union or the integration of financial markets. Okay, sorry. Since the labor single market can be incomplete for cultural reasons, language, emotional attachment, but then when we talk about potential banking union or integration of financial services, there are also TF EU provisions that allow for that or are compatible. And my question is, do you think that after COVID, next gen EU, the European Union will move towards maybe that kind of integration of the single market rather than insisting on labor single market?
Hi, my name is Robert. I'm a first-year MAIR student from the States. First, as somebody from the States, I feel from your discussion that almost the US is kind of behind in terms of adopting more of a single market. My question pertains to the adoption of industrial policies, especially in Europe, and how that transition to adopting industrial policies to investing more in such a change will impact the European project going forward, and whether industrial policy is compatible with more of the free market emphasis that the European Union and the European project was built on. Thanks.
I will stop. I think it's good to put together financial and industrial policy. So why don't you to answer these 2 and then we move ahead?
How much time do we have left? Just so I know. I can give longer or shorter answers.
Let's try to keep. We are getting 40 minutes.
Okay.
But
Okay,
let's try to keep answer reasonably short and then to give opportunity to more questions, and maybe we can go back to some of the issues.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So Alessandra, good question on banking union. So what's striking again here, and this is probably less to do with EU regulation rather than with the fallout of the euro crisis and market behavior per se, but it's quite extraordinary how intra-EU financial flows had become kind of almost denationalized in the pre-Euro crisis world, right? There was an enormous amount of money, of course, from north going to south in search of higher yields and so on, but there was quite a bit of financial integration going on with financial flows, especially compared to like earlier decades, right? That was, of course, a global trend as well. But it seems to me, at least, that the real problem we now face is there's been a kind of a renationalization of financial market conditions, even though all these rules are in place, right? That in theory, you know, if there's banking supervision from the European Central Bank for all these big financial institutions, why should it matter if you're Finnish, whether you put your money in Deutsche Bank or in Monte dei Paschi di Siena or something like that, to give one example, or Santander in Spain or something like this. And now it seems to be the case again. And that's one thing I think Mario Draghi was worried about as ECB president, and now, of course, Christine Lagarde as well, is that there's still different interest rates at which, you know, businesses can borrow, right? And it's so much so that if you are an Austrian company across the Italian border and you go to your local bank, you get much more you know, favorable rates than the Italian company 20 miles away goes to their local Italian bank, right? And so the integration there, I think has quite a long way to go, and that's maybe something that financial regulation can help, but it's still, I think, a problem and I think it's more of a legacy of the Euro crisis, where it's kind of a once bitten, twice shy, right? That people that invested in other countries and then had to take their money out because they were worried of losing it or something, that are maybe more reluctant to do this again, even though, again, I mean, the financial conditions were quite loose all over. Right. That said, I mean, part of me also thinks, I mean, it is natural for people, if they have a bit of money savings, to invest it locally, right? And especially for banks to do so, because they know the local conditions better, they know the counterparts that they're giving loans to much better, and so on. But I think it's been the issue of financial fragmentation since the Euro crisis. I mean, you could say that the part that there was so much money floating around Europe, that this was part of the creation of the Euro crisis in the first place, right? That this was unsustainable as well. But now I feel like we're back to a kind of refragmentation where countries that, you know, like Italy will again struggle compared to Germany, because it's harder to get financing, right? To get loans for small businesses than it is in Germany, for example. And so it's again there. My short answer would be that legal and I mean, cultural barriers are probably still much bigger than legal barriers, and just language and things like that. Industrial policy, that's another very good question, because you're absolutely right? This goes against Europe's DNA to some extent, right? Especially the Europe of today, the Europe of the single market, of Maastricht, that was based on rules, that was poured in treaties that are very hard to change. And the idea, first of all, there's a few problems, right? The EU has no experience in doing industrial policy, right? Countries do. France was quite good at it at some point, right? To some extent, even just so national countries, post-war 50s, 60s, right? I mean, it was the envy of the Brits, right? I mean, there's always, every British government tried to imitate some aspect, whether it was planning, whether it was an industrial ministry, whether they tried to separate the treasury into an economic ministry. I mean, let's talk about this again in labor every 10 years. Can we separate the treasury and the finance from the economic part? And can we do something more for manufacturing? And so the EU has no experience in this whatsoever, right? What the EU can do very well is trade treaties, right? And it's funny, you talk to people at the Commission, and it's very hard for them to make these kind of ad hoc deals with the US on this or that, because, you know, they go in the world and they do trade deals. Right? They have the power to do so. They're very good at it. I mean, as we've seen with the UK trade deal, they run circles around them, right? They have a lot of good personnel doing it. Industrial policy, I think rightly, is where the smaller EU member states, especially the poorer ones, are very skeptical of this. Because if you allow state aid to happen again, and again, we've seen this since 2020, I think it's 76%, 52 to Germany, another 24 to France. All the state aid money that's gone into subsidizing companies, whether it's for the green transition or for whatever, right? De-risking from China. I mean, they can use these excuses now much more easily than they could pre-COVID. And it's not clear that smaller countries that, they just don't have the fiscal space to do this, even though they would not be sanctioned this time by the European Commission. So that's why they've desperately been trying to set up this quote unquote sovereignty fund, right? Where the EU would then compensate smaller countries for the fiscal largesse that they don't have. But that's something that has to be agreed on, has been watered down. It's very hard and so on. So that's why, I mean, I'm skeptical in this when it's a CHIPS Act or something like this, that the EU can do this. But then I'm equally skeptical that the US can do this because they have no tradition of real industrial policy, with the exception of the Pentagon, of course. But that somehow all the things Reagan said what was bad about the government doing this, I mean, these reasons are still valid. Maybe they were never as valid as he claimed they were, but I think it's going to be just as, I mean, I get ready in the next 5 years to read horror stories about the abuse of government money, of Biden's money that was spent. There's going to be some success stories too, don't get me wrong, but I think there's going to be quite a bit of backlash too.
Just maybe just a quick two-hander for you regarding the financial market.
Yeah.
Here you can look at, I think the main difference is that in the US, you have a federal funded deposit insurance, and in Europe, you do not have. So the question, when you have a sovereign bank nexus, what happens is the reason you cannot have a European deposit insurance is because the Germans do not want to bail out Italian banks that have Italian bonds. So the question is one way in which maybe one is how far you can go with the law, when maybe some of the big powers that exist in the federal government are not part of the toolkit of the ECB or the Commission.
Yeah, no, and a quick two-finger answer on this. I mean, this has always been one of those things where I thought was low-hanging fruit for the EU, is the equivalent of the FDIC guaranteed sticker, right? On every bank window in the US, is that if you had an EU sticker that said, we have EU deposit insurance, but again, it's something that still has enough political opposition in Germany.
Yeah, because it would be
It's a transfer. Yeah, it
will be a large transfer to the south. Please, new wave of questions.
New wave.
My name is Hannah. I'm a first-year international affairs student. Is that a question, more reaction? Because I wouldn't say I'm from Germany. I don't think it's merely a political issue. It's a legal issue, as you were hinting now. It's a constitutional issue, and it's incompatible. Our constitutional court right now, or at least one chamber of it, says that it's completely incompatible, right? And so I think that's just where integration will end unless we do a constitutional amendment, which I think nobody has the energy to do right now. So sorry, I just wanted to add that because
No, it's an excellent question, right? And that's where I think the German Constitutional Court ruling on what was it, like 65 billion euros that the Scholz government had set aside in all kinds of ways that were not part of the debt break. That I think I'm of the camp, and Professor Vera Zamani is here. I think she would probably agree that this is one of the biggest fiscal economic own goals Germany ever scored, right, in 2009, and this was quite across parties, where you constrain yourselves even more than the EU has ever constrained you, right? Because in the end, Maastricht has safeguards, and you can declare. I mean, so yeah, but they have it too. But this whole 0.35% structural deficit is the max. That was, again, it was fine for a world where Germany was booming, had balanced budgets, was paying down debt. I mean, again, we were having these discussions, well, what are we going to do in Europe? Is there no more German debt because they're paying it all down? We had these same discussions in the US in 2001 when people thought there was going to be no more US debt because there were all these structural surpluses in the late 90s. And, in Peterson in DC, they were having reasonable debates about what are we going to do in financial markets if there are no more US treasuries because everything's been paid down. Of course, that George Bush was president and the problem was gone very, very quickly through tax cuts and military buildup and wars and so on. But you're absolutely right. I think if there's no reform on this, and it doesn't seem like there is political or like a political impetus to do this, the CDU supports it. I think the Greens don't, clearly, but the Greens is what, 14% of the vote, right? I mean, that said, I am surprised that they managed to find a fiscal deal during this debacle, right? Because remember, there was this negotiation of how to make the rules more flexible, right? The rules that had become tightened in 2010, 2012, with the fiscal compact and the six-pack and the two-pack and all these treaties, right? That were passed to make it even harder and more automatic and rules-based to balance your budgets and so on. Now, in a world where, I mean, here's a German government that wants to spend more on defense, that wants to do more for the energy transition, that actually managed to wean itself off Russian oil and gas in a record time. I mean, I would like to think that surely they're going to find a way to declare another emergency for 2024 and somehow do some of this. That said, there is real pressure to say, and that's, they seem to be making the mistake that the Cameron-Osborne coalition made in the UK in 2010, is that you slash capital spending because the people don't feel it right away, right? You slash research and development, you slash all the plans they had for digitization, and even to some extent for the green transition. And that was the glue of this coalition, right? I mean, these are the traffic light coalition are very unnatural partners. And the glue was, we're going to do the green transition and we're going to do digitization. And that was, remember, this is the coalition that what, 2/3 of the youth, the young voted for, right? Because overwhelmingly they voted FDP or Green. I think 1/3 of the young Green, 1/3 of the young voted FDP because they wanted modernization of the government. And that's what Lindner, who became finance minister, ran on. And now it's extraordinary how they're, and that's what makes it politically impossible to sell, right? You cannot say, okay, the rest of Europe gets to be more flexible with their fiscal policy, while at the same time, we in Germany to some extent will pay for it. And then you will pay for it even domestically by having worse education and health. And you're still going to have to send a fax to your doctor if you want another subscription and so on.
More questions?
Hi, my name is Giulio. I'm a fellow here. And I'm interested in your point about overshooting regulation in the EU, but I wonder if we could go back to basics, the lack of fiscal policy, unique fiscal policy in EU, because we don't have a fiscal policy, common fiscal policy, which would have to pay education, investment, and implicitly decision on taxation of capital and labor. Take Ireland and the Netherlands, for instance, or different taxation about labor, which makes companies willing. So in a sense, could one think that this overshooting in legislation on the one hand is a compensation to create a more functioning market given the lack of fiscal policy? In other terms, public goods are not provided in the optimal way. So more or less, there is a common wisdom that the private market could provide publicly or privately produced public goods. This is a bit of a, and possibly this could also explain why the main, in a sense, supporters of the single markets are firms, large firms in Europe. In the US, large firms developed in the 19th century. In Europe, not. So are they possibly the lobbies of larger firms in Europe, the one who are pushing for a push, as you said, possibly too much in this so-called single market? We know agricultural people, where are they? And that could be also a populist backlash, which explains a lot in terms of the current political situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Acheson. You were already teaching here when I was a student here, so that's been a while. Macroeconomics. And I think you were the favorite over the other guy who I don't remember the name. So anyway, very, very good question. Shall not be named. Nobody's named. Nobody's named. Excellent. I think you make an excellent complementary point to this, right? I mean, I think to some extent that was true on the fiscal side in the US, right? So the US has a federal government that's quite large, right? Especially from a macroeconomic point of view, it can act, at least if Congress does, can act quite quickly, right? So the internal lag can be slow, but once it's decided, I mean, they literally send checks in the mail and you have it the next week, right? And then you can spend that money. It's incredibly fast. And it's also very clear in the US, the division of labor is most states have balanced budget rules themselves, right? And so because the federal government provides these public goods, because it's not the case in Europe they probably felt the need that the rules have to be a lot stricter, right? And you're absolutely right. I mean, the fact that it is incredibly contentious. I mean, this idea of fiscal policy as a core state power, right? Which in a way, I think you can make that case for single market rules too, right? Because it's about people's daily lives, right? I mean, licensing and degree requirements and all these things. And it goes quite far in many ways in Europe, right? That in a way that, you know, populists make hay of it, right? Because it's like Europe is in our lives everywhere, right? And maybe to a fault because the economic benefits are very small. So I think that's what you mentioned is going to be the major challenge for the EU going forward when they ever start talking about either doing another next generation EU, which would be the French preference, or paying it down and shutting it down, which would be the German preference still today. And the argument there was we're going to do it with our own resources. But that's yet to be debated, right? I mean, I'm almost cynically thinking that they're going to have to increase the common external tariff vis-a-vis the US and China to have some real revenue again, and that will then be EU revenue, but that will come at considerable cost, right? So, yeah, let me just answer by saying I think it's a big part of the explanation on why coalitions, especially big business in the US, jumped on the single market as an actionable thing. But even there, I mean, if you look at the liberalization of telecoms, for example, right, it's still striking to me that for many national companies that they even pushed for it because supposedly a monopoly position is quite comfortable, right? And they had to, same with national airlines, right? That, I mean, that's something that's changed quite significantly, right? That you can now fly between, let's say, Brussels and Rome, and you don't have two choices. You probably have more choices. Vera Zamani. Uh-oh.
Yes, I'm rather puzzled about your statement on the 4 to 5 times higher domestic trade in the United States with reference to Europe. And I have 2 or 3 comments to make. First, are the American numbers correct? You know, because in Europe they are, because it's international trade in any case for us. So we have a very well organized way of picking it up. No? And then we divide this international trade between domestic and external. No? But what about in the United States? How is the domestic trade measured? So this is my first question. My second question is the following. If it is correct and the numbers are correct, then it means that in Europe, people prefer to consume, use domestic services, local national services and national goods compared with United States, in spite of all the legal efforts to internationalize. And this could be connected with the fact that some European countries are quite large and so are very diversified. Maybe in the United States, the states are smaller, or there are cultural roots, very long tradition of having different, think of the 100 French cheeses, different cheeses, or the 100 Italian different pasta shapes. No? The pasta is all the same, but the shapes are different, and therefore no, each one wants to consume. So this might, and my third point is the following. Has ever somebody measured the homogenization of the European market after these rules, or there is no such study, and we don't know actually the impact of these rules. So these are my comments.
Yeah, just add one thing, because her last question is exactly what I demanded in the very beginning. Why should we just look at quantity, not at prices? So maybe what I would like to know is what is a measure of integration is looking at the variability of prices across market. Maybe this is more important than quantity per se. Yeah. Just to have a measure of how separate the market are.
Excellent questions, Professor Zamani. How is trade measured? Well, I think we take most of our numbers from someone like Philippe Aguillon, who's done a whole book on who's an economist at MIT, who's done a whole book on the US single market, and I mean, makes these points quite explicit. I mean, I'll give you one example, like Boeing, right? Boeing operates in 49 states by design because they want 2 senators to support every subsidy that comes their way, right? So I imagine there's an enormous amount of trade just within one company, right? So intra-firm trade in the US is significantly higher than in Europe because of sort of some of those domestic biases that you mentioned. So I don't think we go into great detail. I mean, maybe that's a mistake of ours. We kind of take U.S. economists' word for it that this is the case. That is true 4 to 5 times. On your second question on preferences for domestic services, I mean, yeah, and goods, cheese and pasta, and yeah, so that's, I mean, yeah, it's a good point. I mean, first of all, let me also stress that much of the US internal trade is, I mean, a lot of this is based by a simple gravity equation, right? I mean, like just like trade between US states that border Canada and Canadian states is a lot higher than, let's say, these states. And so if you take, for example, New York, right, which borders Ontario, there's a lot more trade between New York and Ontario than, let's say, between New York and Oklahoma, right? Clearly. And this is international versus domestic, and that's just purely because of proximity. But I mean, yeah, I don't want to answer that, but again, the numbers that we did find, even though that wasn't our main point, right? I guess we kind of take the puzzle is not so much to me why it's smaller in volume in Europe than in the US. I think you can explain this quite well by cultural explanations and language and you know, legal things and understandings. The puzzle is more like why you know, if it's the case that the legal framework in the US is much less developed to impose a single market than in Europe, that's it. And then on the question of prices versus quantities, again, I mean, I imagine the single market must have done quite a bit to make prices equal. But again, I don't know, just anecdotally, I see way bigger differences still here in services, especially in prices, right? Where certain things are much cheaper in certain countries than in others. So I mean, I don't know if the single market has solved that per se, even though undeniably there's a lot more trade in goods and services than there has been in 50 years ago, right? And that's where I think, I mean, as I always tell people, you know, you should compare yourself to where you used to be rather than to where you want to be, right? I always tell students this: don't compare yourself to the one superstar in class, but maybe to where you were self or 2 years ago or something, right? Or if you really must, compare yourself to somebody significantly weaker than you, and then you'll feel better about it rather than constantly. It's like any basketball player comparing themselves with Michael Jordan, right? I mean, you're always going to come short.
More questions? Yes, Dan.
Thank you for your talk. I'm Dare Lange. I'm a first-year Maya student. And my question is regarding the pressure that the EU still has on tearing down these boundaries. I was wondering whether there was a significant change after Brexit, because I can see the normative argument for economic integration to create a union, and that kind of arguably backfired during Brexit because Brexit was kind of a sign of that backfiring. So I was wondering whether there was a change in pressure after.
It's a very good question. I mean, I definitely was one of those people in 2017 I see Mark Gilbert is here, and I think he shared my skepticism, right? That Europe at that moment looked really bad. I mean, I wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs saying this is the biggest crisis the EU has faced in its history. I think in hindsight that was probably exaggerated. At the time, nobody had ever left, right? I mean, a member, a big member, an important member leaving the European Union at a time where Euroscepticism, and it's not like they didn't have a point, right? I mean, they're the types that said they were all a bunch of crazies, and you know that this was exploited for different reasons, and everybody who voted for Brexit voted not actually for Brexit but for something else. And I mean, there's probably some truth to all these things. But that said, at the time in 2017, it seemed like, and this was the beginning of the Juncker Commission, right? The middle, Juncker said things like, well, you know, we should probably press the pause button on enlargement. We should probably actually, you know, this is when they gotten really serious about the democratic deficit being too far from the people and so on. What's interesting, of course, is that two things have happened since 2017, right? Or 2016 when they voted to leave. 2017 when they, I guess, pressed the button, the two-year clock button in, I guess, March 2017, right? And then they extended that 2-year period a few times. But it became very clear how hard it was to disentangle you from the EU, and that it wasn't necessarily going to be easy, beneficial, and that it came at a very high cost, right? Even for a member as the UK that wasn't in the Euro, that wasn't in Schengen, right? And that had its own very long tradition of trade with the rest of the world, right? And actually, I think that what's often exaggerated is what's striking, and again, Mark Gilbert will know this better than me, but when the UK joined the European Economic Community, trade grew incredibly fast with Europe. But then by 1980, it's plateaued to about 65% of its total trade. And then it actually has started to fall a bit because Europe wasn't growing particularly fast in the 90s and the 2000s. The rest of the world, of course, was. And then, of course, since Brexit, it's gone down even further because now we know why it's gotten even harder, right? So that's happened. And on the other hand, the pandemic happened, right? And here, and I mentioned this in Justin Frosini's class an hour ago, I mean, there's this kind of happening of, you can call it a fortuitous event, but the fact is the UK left the EU political institutions on January 31, 2020. And 5 weeks later, Lombardy was shut down because of COVID, right? I mean, the beginning of COVID was really in Italy and spread very quickly. And I mean, for anybody, and there's many in the room who've studied European integration closely, it is extraordinary how quick the EU responded to this crisis. Even more extraordinary how quickly they responded to Ukraine in a matter of days. It still took weeks, right, to come to terms with COVID. But there, I think the idea suddenly that you were going to shut down the single market because the Germans didn't want to send masks to the Italians, and I think that was a kind of wake-up call where. And you see this in the surveys, for a lot of people, it had to be EU solidarity, right? And so the idea of Corona bonds, which then became Next Generation EU, I think had massive support in Europe, right? And I think so that's at the same time with Trump being president and this kind of geopolitical world, but there's a lot more people who now actually want more Europe rather than less. I mean, that's the Europe of the Eurocrats may dream of. That's a different story. But I think, I mean, if you look at the biggest Eurosceptic countries today, starting with Hungary, at least the leadership is Eurosceptic, but 80% of Hungarians don't want to leave, right? And so that was true in Poland as well, and so on. So I don't know if that's a good answer to your question, but that's where. That doesn't mean that they want more single market rules, right? They want to see different things, whether it's common defense, whether it's things like that. Of course, the devil is always in the detail there, where actually agreeing on this and then who's going to pay for it? Because that seems to me the biggest question with Ukraine. Who's going to pay for it?
Okay, maybe you told us the Brexit was a blessing in disguise. So let's take the last round of questions.
Hey, yeah. I unfortunately wasn't able to make the talk. I just wanted to add a little postula to what you've just said. Also, it's not just a question of the people's support for the European Union. It's also the fact European Union, we shouldn't underestimate that it has a mechanism, i.e. the European Council, which enables it to make quite rapid decisions. I think you think of Luc van Mittelaar's work, and he really emphasized, and also his subsequent, some of his subsequent books. And I think he's right about that, because the European Council, when you think of it, 27 different countries of totally different kinds and sizes and so forth. It really is remarkable how quickly they can work together sometimes. And I think we underestimate that. It's just purely.
Any other questions? And then we wrap up. Yeah, yes, please.
Give me a second, sir.
Hi, my name is John Kojan, and I'm a SAIS graduate from the previous century. And now I teach a course here this semester on global financial institutions. And I just wanted to remark about the comments you made in the US and states' rights and stuff. If you're an insurance company in the US, you are regulated in 50 different states, and you have to apply for a charter in each of those 50 states. Now, many insurance companies in the US are relatively localized, like the Kentucky Farm Bureau, but there are large-scale insurance companies that are regulated 50 times over. And let's say you are an insurtech, an emerging insurance company, you got to go to 50 states. Now, one thing, New York tends to be kind of like a little bit of a role model, so other states will often follow their lead. But think about the cost, right? The cost to the insurance companies, the cost to the individual states. And so that's apropos to the point you raised early on.
Any more? Okay.
Thanks, John. Didn't you teach at DC as well?
Yes.
Yeah. So, but yeah, we haven't actually. We'll add insurance companies as a very good example. That said, I mean, I imagine much of the regulation of insurance companies in even Europe is still mostly national, right? Even though I think the ECB and the banking unions, Europe is doing more, but it's still mostly for the big financial institutions. But yeah, it's an excellent point. Anyway, let me thank everybody, especially the ones who are still here, because one tendency I've been lamenting my 20 years connection to SAIS is that nobody stays till the end anymore of these seminars. So anyway, thank you for staying to the end.
Thank you.